I'm Sam Roberts of the New York Times, and welcome to the New York Times Close Up. Joe Biden's first 100 days as president have come and gone. Overall, they went pretty well. He turned down the political temperature and got a COVID relief package through Congress, although without Republican votes. Now it looks like the honeymoon may be over. Biden has been meeting with Republican senators to try and cut a deal for a public works package. So far, no sign of compromise. Mitch McConnell said he's, quote, 100% focused on stopping the Biden administration. Last week, the House passed a bill with 35 GOP votes to set up a bipartisan investigative commission into the January 6th attack on the Capitol. But McConnell opposes that too, which makes passage in the Senate very unlikely. Meanwhile, Biden was hit with his first overseas crisis, Hamas firing thousands of rockets at Israel, and the Israelis responding with air raids and artillery fire. They agreed to a tenuous ceasefire, but the outlook for it holding is uncertain. The political blowback for Biden came when many fellow Democrats pushed him to take a tougher line with Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu. Worth noting, Reuters Ipsos has Biden's job approval at 56%. So what's the outlook for his agenda and for bipartisanship? We're joined by Peter Baker, the New York Times White House chief correspondent, and Alex Burns, Times National Political Correspondent. Peter, was there a honeymoon at all? And if so, was that honeymoon now over?
Well, there was a honeymoon in the sense that, Joe Biden has engendered goodwill among many people in Washington on both sides of the aisle. He's well liked even among Republicans. They appreciate, I think, that he has been more willing to lower the temperature, as you said, and he's not been a particularly incendiary figure compared to, of course, his predecessor. There hasn't really been a honeymoon if you measure it by, bipartisan action, any kind of willingness on the two parties to come together on mutual shared priorities. So far, there has been almost no evidence of that. And it doesn't seem to be likely to be in the next 100 days either, quite honestly, that this infrastructure negotiation does not seem to be leading toward, a consensus approach at this point. There's still a lot to be done on this policing reform measure. It's possible that could be bipartisan. There does seem to be some hope for that. But there's so many different issues right now where the two parties are at loggerheads. And in that sense, there has not been much of a honeymoon for President Biden.
Alex Burns, how long can the Republicans go without really offering any sort of alternative? Mitch McConnell suggested that perhaps he has some ideas as an alternative in terms of public works, infrastructure legislation, but the Republicans can't just sit back and say no, no, no for the next 2 or 4 years, can they?
Well, Sam, I think the reality is that they probably can. They may pay a price for it in some form or another, but the way the Congress is configured right now, Democrats have majorities in both chambers, but majorities by the slenderest margins possible. And the opposition party in our more or less cyclical political system tends to do well in midterm and off-year elections. So the Republicans are largely making a bet that the playing field will be tilted in their direction in 2022. And if they can just do whatever they can to slow down Biden's agenda and Biden's party in the interim, that they stand a pretty good chance of recapturing Congress. And I think that anybody you talk to on either side will acknowledge that all of that is true. I think the bigger risk, Sam, is over the slightly longer term when you're looking towards the next presidential election. And certainly if Biden and the Democrats manage to mobilize their party for the midterms in a way that they have typically failed to do when there's a Democratic president, that the absence of a compelling Republican agenda and the party's extreme sensitivity to what former President Trump seems to want to think and talk about day to day definitely could cost them at the margin.
Peter, why is it that the public, which seems to be giving President Biden a pretty good approval rating at the moment and giving him the benefit of the doubt, is willing to let the Republicans just trail off without an agenda, without any alternatives of their own, instead of giving the president the benefit of the doubt and letting him go ahead with his agenda for better or for worse, letting the president go wherever it takes him at this point.
Well, let's try a thought experiment there, Sam. If it were President Trump in there and Democrats were going along with his agenda early in his term, they would be crucified by members of their own party for caving in to policies they don't agree with. Well, that's the case for the Republicans as well. If they were to go along with President Biden on the priorities that they don't agree with, basically, at least in terms of the size and scale of some of these spending items and the tax increases and the voting rights legislation and the some of the gun rights and immigration, all these other issues that are important to President Biden, they would be crucified by members of their party. So there's very little incentive structure in Washington these days for bipartisanship on either side, quite honestly. That the reward system has changed. In the old days, there used to be a sense of accomplishment and reward. If you were seen as bipartisan, today you risk being pilloried by the more louder voices within your party, and those are the ones who have an inordinate influence right now in these elections. As Alex said, the Republicans right now look at the midterms and they have a pretty good hand going in. Why mess that up by alienating their base at this point? So I think that's the calculation you see.
Very good point, Peter. What are the Republicans for, Alex? Do they have a platform or is it just no, no, no to Biden?
Well, I think what they can certainly all agree on is no, no, no to most of the Biden priorities that Peter just mentioned, gun control, immigration reform, subjects like that. I do think that we are starting to see a real conversation in the Republican Party about what they would like to stand for. I think there's a recognition that President Trump pretty much wiped away the traditional conservative consensus platform that we saw, from the Reagan era through really Barack Obama's term, right, on issues like immigration and trade and foreign policy and national security, that there's been a big reset on the Republican side. But I think it's going to be a long process of figuring out what a conservative platform looks like post-Trump. We have figures in the party who want to stick it to big corporations, but not necessarily by raising their taxes, right? That you have figures in the party who want to be much more isolationist when it comes to national security, but they coexist side by side with figures like Mitch McConnell, who is much more conventionally hawkish in favor of a robust American foreign policy. I don't think that you're going to get a clear definition of what the Republican Party's aspirational agenda is until the next time it chooses a presidential nominee. And in some ways, that's okay for them. It's what we saw happen with the Democrats during the Trump years, right? There's always a lot of a hand-wringing in the first year after a presidential election within the defeated party, just saying, my goodness, who is our leader? What are our ideas? Anyway, again, I think the real complexity to this for Republicans, the real challenge for Republicans is the role of Trump himself, that it's hard for the party to have a really healthy, expansive contest of ideas when it's so dominated by one personality.
When it's so dominated by that one personality, and also when it is so stubborn about creating a January 6th investigative commission. Why are the Republicans so uptight about that? I mean, you can argue that they would like a broader agenda, that they want to investigate other terrorist activities too, perhaps, but how can they be against looking into what many people regard as an insurrection against the United States, Peter?
Well, look, Republicans look at it as a trap. They see it as a trap by Democrats to set up a report that would come out at some point next year, even though Pelosi says it will be finished by the end of this year, thick in the middle of the midterm election season in order to make the Republicans look bad and hurt them at the polls. So they see this as a partisan trap on the part of Democrats, nothing to be gained here from their point of view. Remember, this is, Pelosi started off with a proposal that was pretty one-sided. Her original proposal suggested a commission that was dominated by Democrats. Democrats alone had subpoena power. Republicans were basically a feckless minority. Now, she eventually gave in and to their concessions to create a more 9/11 style commission, which would be evenly balanced between the parties, which did give both parties subpoena power, that did in fact more closely resemble the 9/11 commission, which had a great deal of respect in this country. But by that point, Republicans had already decided that they weren't going to play that game. They don't want to talk about January 6th. They don't want to talk about the insurrection. They don't want to talk about the election fraud complaints that President Trump still wants to talk about. They want to focus on President Biden's agenda so they can say they're in opposition to that and wage this campaign next year on the questions that they are more comfortable with, spending and taxes, more traditional Republican issues. As Alex said, this is a party that doesn't have a lot that brings it together right now. Remember, the parties have a chance every 4 years to tell us what they stand for. It's called a platform at their convention. Last year, they chose not to even put up a platform, if you can believe that. Instead, their only platform was reelecting Donald Trump and the people who support him. That's the one thing that party has made clear it stands for at this point, other than opposition to President Biden. So I think that they look at January 6th as something to put in the past and move on from as best and fast as they can.
Of course, that assumes anyone ever remembers a platform after that party convention in the middle of the summer before the election. Alex, what about placating the left? Where does Biden stand on that? And as we mentioned earlier, the Mideast raises a new specter for him in terms of support for Israel.
Well, Sam, I think that one of the places where you have seen a more pronounced honeymoon period for Biden has been with the left. That there are all kinds of vocal leaders on that flank of the party. Obviously, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, those kinds of figures who made it very clear going into the Biden administration that they were going to be driving him hard from the left flank of party. And they have mostly blunted their criticism of him and sort of stayed inside the tent. The White House, I think, by all accounts, has done quite a good job of reaching out to those folks and making sure that they feel heard on policy, on personnel, making sure that there's no incentive right now for them to go their own way and express real dissent with the president's platform. I think it's going to get harder to maintain that sort of moment of good feelings going forward, because there was this period of explosive action at the beginning of the administration in appointments, executive orders, the use of a budget reconciliation to pass the rescue package that you mentioned before. And now we're on to the stuff that is much, much harder even than that to get enshrined into policy or into actual legislation. And so I think it's an open question how much patience the left is going to have for Biden if he wants to, really spin out for weeks and weeks and maybe months to come bipartisan negotiations on infrastructure, bipartisan negotiations on policing, on immigration. And Biden's in a tough spot here because he has only 50 seats in the Senate. He doesn't have a great option other than bipartisanship. But as Peter said at the top, he doesn't have a great option to do it by bipartisanship either.
Peter, on the other side of the spectrum, of course, we still have the former president, if not tweeting, then emailing and making his voice known by other means. We have Marjorie Taylor Greene still speaking out in her own way. So what is the likelihood of any sort of compromise when it comes to public works programs, infrastructure, policing, and other things that are high up on the Biden agenda?
Look, you can see how bipartisan compromise could come together if both sides really wanted it to come together, right? President Biden proposed $2.3 trillion in infrastructure. Republicans counter with $600 billion. They came up to $800 billion. The president's come down to $1.7 trillion. I mean, they're still far apart, but this is how a normal negotiation might go, and you'd end up someplace in the middle at 1.3 or 1.4 or whatever. These are not traditional times. We cannot assume that that's where they will end up because, in fact, that's not the way the system works right now. If President Biden were to come down to any number that would be acceptable to Republicans, he would start taking flack that Alex is alluding to from the left. Likewise, Republicans worry that they would lose an issue that they think is a pretty good one for them, which is this is a socialist, big spending, big government administration that we need to stand up to. Now, at one point, there was talk of a clever compromise where they would have two separate packages, one that would be more modest in size, focus on traditional public works programs that are everybody agrees is infrastructure, and that Republicans could go along with that, and then the Democrats would force the rest through on reconciliation, which is that process Alex just talked about, where they only need a majority, and the Republicans could oppose that, and that way both sides could get something. It's actually kind of an elegant solution, but they don't seem to be heading in that direction at the moment. And again, I think that Washington is just prefers being at odds with each other these days rather than coming together, even on things where they think have some shared interests.
Elegance is that we haven't seen in Washington in quite a while. You're absolutely right. Peter Baker, Alex Burns, the New York Times, thank you for joining us. And coming up next, inside the Times' busy Metropolitan desk. The New York Times Metropolitan desk has a full plate these days. We're just weeks away from what many are calling the most consequential mayoral primary in a generation. New York's future may be on the line. The 8 candidates held a virtual debate recently and are pushing for in-person debates in the coming weeks. They're also wrapping up old-fashioned retail politicking as well as TV advertising. This is happening in the midst of a surge in violent crime and shootings, as well as an uptick in attacks on the subway. And the subways are back to running 24 hours a day after being shut down overnight due to COVID. The question is, will riders return to pre-pandemic levels, bringing back much needed revenue? Meanwhile, the city's economy is reopening with indoor dining, fewer mask restrictions, and fans in the stands at ball games. Are New Yorkers ready to get back to normal, or will they still be cautious and hold back an economic recovery? So how's the Times covering this tsunami of New York news? Let's ask the man who's making sure that it does, James Dao, the Times' new Metropolitan editor, a quintessential Times journalist, and my former editor on the Metropolitan desk. Jim, you have a amazing job when the Times is covering and focusing so much on national, global news and coverage. What is your mission as Metropolitan editor?
Hey, Sam, and great to see you again. The mission is in part no different than any other previous Metro editor's mission, which is just to cover New York as well as we can and as comprehensively as we can. What obviously makes it unique and quite remarkable and really perhaps more of a national story than ever now is obviously the pandemic and this moment being one where New York is really working hard to try to pull itself out of the pandemic. And so many things that are already important stories in New York, most prominently the mayor's race, suddenly become even more significant because of this moment we're in. My job and the entire staff's job is to not only cover it in a way that is meaningful and useful and insightful for New York residents, but also to really help the rest of the country and to some degree, people all over the world really comprehend what New York is going through and how it's working hard to pull out of this pandemic. And that's important, not only because other cities may look to New York as an example and maybe even a template in some ways, but also because New York was so ravaged by the pandemic. And so many eyes of the world were looking at the city more than a year ago when it was suffering so much through the pandemic. And people, I think, everywhere want to know, how is the place doing?
I always found that people around the world, around the country, were fascinated by New York news, regardless of whether they had any connection with the city or not, regardless of whether they were expatriates or not. There was something about the city, the lore of the city, the connections they had in terms of the size, the superlatives that made them interested in whatever happened here. But one of the things that's different, I think, about the mission today is that we assume that because of television, because of the internet, most people probably get their breaking news elsewhere than they do from certainly the newspaper and maybe to some extent even on the web itself. So how does that change our mission, and how does it change your mission in print and versus what we present on nytimes.com in terms of metropolitan news?
Well, we don't want to give up our mission of bringing readers everywhere breaking news about New York City. I think clearly our role is different than it was back when you were on the Metro desk and I was either a reporter or deputy editor on the Metro desk, when we covered a lot of breaking news, and we covered a lot of what might have now seemed like sort of smaller developments on stories, just because they were meaningful to New Yorkers and New Yorkers are following them closely. We do a lot less of that now because we are so much more national facing and we have a global readership. But that said, I think, there are going to be big stories that happen in New York that we want to tell right on the news. We want to tell it quickly. We want to get it up online quickly because they are significant stories, and people not just in New York but elsewhere might be turning to look at those stories. And we did it, for instance, this week with a story about Mayor de Blasio's decision to not have virtual school in the fall. It's a story we jumped on quickly, got online quickly, and built out through the day. That's a story that New Yorkers obviously care about deeply, but school parents and school officials and cities all around the country are looking at what New York's doing as well, because in some ways the city has provided an important precedent for what policymakers elsewhere might be thinking about doing.
We once called ourselves, or people called us, the paper of record, which we were for better or for worse. Sometimes when you look back, we were more stenographic as a record than perhaps we should have been. Now we don't do that much anymore. We have a lot more analysis. How do we draw that line between analysis, perspective, context, and opinion? When people say, that line gets a little blurry sometimes when we're trying to provide that perspective on what things really mean, why they are happening, as opposed to the fact that there is something just out there.
Yeah, it's a great question. My predecessor, Cliff Levy, and I were joking about this. We were both in Albany many years ago, and we were thinking back to the day when we would write 150 stories a year. Often several stories a day out of Albany, and those days are gone. We just don't do that anymore. And it's an interesting question. It's one almost every reporter and editor on the Metro section asked me when I first joined: is how are we're going to draw the line between breaking news that we need to do now versus stepping back and doing a deeper story that might take longer on a particular issue, and where are we just going to sort of ignore certain things because we consider them too small bore or incremental? And there's no easy answer to that. It's a case by case issue. We're not going to cover every murder in the city. We never did, and we're not going to start. But there are going to be some that are particularly heinous or meaningful or significant, and that we are going to jump on. And we're in a incredibly complicated and sort of hard to track mayor's race right now, because it's a lot of candidates in a new voting system. We don't fully know exactly who's ahead. We kind of have a general sense, but nobody's got a really sense of that clearly. And so we could write lots and lots of stories every day off that campaign trail, and we don't. We choose not to. We step back. We try to, to use a journalistic term that we've long thrown around at the Times, we collect thread. We reporters see things. We don't necessarily write a story that day, but we hold on to it, and we see if it sort of begins to become something that we can weave into a broader tapestry, and that in a deeper story that can help readers understand a broader trend in the mayoral campaign. And so that's what we try to do on, in all areas. And you raise the point about news analysis and the fear that that'll kind of maybe seep into the world of opinion. And I remember when I first became a political reporter at the Times, we used to have the very same debate, like I was asked to write what we call Q-heads, news analysis pieces out of Albany. And you did thousands of these, I'm sure. And it felt uncomfortable to me at first when I first did it. But I think, you learn after a time that there's a way to do it without expressing a personal preference, a personal opinion. There's a reporter who knows a beat, who knows a subject can bring analytical thoughts that help readers make sense of lots of what might seem disparate facts that are pulled together. And you can do that without, giving your personal opinion. And we feel, that's a real added value thing that the Times can bring to our news coverage.
It is indeed. It's an art. Quick last question, very quick. Does local journalism still have the impact that you think it used to have?
I just think local journalism is just incredibly important now, and more than ever. There's so many important things that happen locally, and when there aren't strong papers covering it, those events, those trends don't don't bubble up into the national dialogue, and that's a terrible thing for the country. I just think it's incredibly important for local news to be available, to be documenting what's happening in their communities, so that federal officials, state officials, governors can really get a sense of what are the big trends that are gripping the country.
Well, that's why we wish you the best of luck. James Dao, the new Metropolitan editor of the New York Times, thank you for joining us. For the New York Times and CUNY TV, I'm Sam Roberts.